Egypt sits on the most valuable 120 miles of water on Earth. Every year, over $1 trillion in cargo squeezes through the Suez Canal. In 2023 alone, the canal pulled in a record $10.25 billion in toll revenue. And yet, Egypt owes $164 billion in foreign debt. The pound has lost 81% of its value since 2016. A third of its 106 million people live below the poverty line. Egypt owns the world's most strategic choke point, and it still can't pay its bills. And in 2024, the one thing keeping this country afloat nearly disappeared overnight. November 2023. Houthi militants started attacking commercial ships in the Red Sea. Within months, Suez Canal revenue collapsed 61%, from $10.25 billion to $3.99 billion. Ship transits halved. Egypt lost over $6 billion from its most important revenue stream in a single year. Now here's the number that should terrify you. In that same year, Egypt owed $32.8 billion in debt servicing alone, more than 8 times what the canal earned. 83% of government revenue goes to paying off old debts. Not schools, not hospitals, debt. Meanwhile, 70 million Egyptians depend on government-subsidized bread to survive. Egypt is the world's #1 wheat importer, 12 to 14 million metric tons every year, the majority from Russia and Ukraine. If this economy collapses, you're looking at a migration crisis hitting Europe, Israel losing its only Arab peace partner, and 12 to 15% of global maritime trade at risk. To understand how a country with this much strategic leverage ended up this broke, you have to go back to one of the most dramatic power grabs of the 20th century. July 26, 1956. President Gamal Abdel Nasser walks up to a podium in Alexandria and announces that Egypt is nationalizing the Suez Canal, seizing it from British and French control. Britain, France, and Israel invade. The United States and the Soviet Union, Cold War enemies agreeing on almost nothing, both tell them to stand down. Egypt keeps the canal. This was the moment Egypt gained its greatest asset. It was also the moment Egypt gained its greatest curse, the belief that the canal would make everything else work. Between 1967 and 1975, the canal was closed for 8 years after the Six-Day War. Egypt survived without it, barely. But the dependency infrastructure was already being built. Foreign aid, US military patronage, IMF lifelines, a pattern of borrowing to stay afloat while hoping the canal would eventually fix everything. September 17, 1978, Camp David Accords. Egypt became the first Arab nation to make peace with Israel, and in exchange, the US started paying $1.3 billion a year in military aid, a number that hasn't changed in over 45 years. Do the math. America's second largest military aid recipient after Israel, a 3-to-2 ratio baked into the relationship since 1979. Egypt's generals got a permanent paycheck, and Washington got a permanent ally. Everyone won, except ordinary Egyptians. Fast forward to 2013, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, career military officer, defense minister, overthrew the elected president, won the presidency in June 2014. His project, Make Egypt a Modern Power Through Sheer Concrete. August 6, 2015. Sisi inaugurated the new Suez Canal, an $8 billion expansion funded entirely by Egyptian citizens buying 12% interest bonds. Sold out in 8 days. Teachers, taxi drivers, pensioners, they lined up at banks because Sisi told them this would double the canal's revenue to $13 billion a year. It was the biggest crowdfunding campaign in Egyptian history. Sisi called it a gift from the Egyptian people to the world. Reality: canal revenue fell from $5.5 billion in 2014 to $5 billion in 2016. The gift was to the people who sold the bonds. Now here's the before picture you need to remember. In 2013, Egypt's external debt was roughly $45.5 billion. The pound traded at about 7 to the dollar. Within a decade, both numbers would become unrecognizable. So Egypt had the canal, American backing, Gulf money, and a strongman with a plan. What could go wrong? Almost everything. Here's what the mega-project narrative hides. Egypt's military doesn't just defend the country, it runs it. The armed forces operate over 70 companies across construction, cement, steel, water, food, gas stations, hotels, and media. The IMF's own 2025 review found military-owned companies hold up to 36% market share in cement, marble, granite, and steel. They identified 97 companies in military ownership. These companies pay no taxes, use conscript labor, get no-bid government contracts, and face zero oversight. Sisi himself claims the military controls just 1.5 to 2% of the economy. The IMF found 97 companies controlling 36% of heavy industry. Someone is lying, and it's not the IMF. The Suez Canal Authority itself has been run by former naval officers since 1964. In December 2022, a new Suez Canal Fund was created, supervised by what they call a sovereign entity, code for military and intelligence services. The biggest obstacle to Egypt's economy isn't the canal losing traffic. It's the army eating the economy from the inside. Between 2013 and 2024, every single number that matters – debt, currency, food prices, private investment – moved in exactly the wrong direction. Here's how bad it got. Egypt's external debt in 2013, $45.5 billion. By 2017, $79 billion. By 2020, $132 billion. December 2023, $168 billion, the all-time peak. That's a 269% increase in 10 years. But it gets worse. External debt interest payments went from $1.53 billion in 2016 to $9.47 billion in 2023. A six-fold increase just in interest. The debt-to-GDP ratio peaked at 97.8% in 2017. Every single Egyptian pound the dollar rises costs the budget an additional £110 billion. Here is the kicker. Egypt has been locked out of international bond markets since March 2022. 4 years. A country with 108 million people and one of the world's most important waterways, and it can't borrow on the open market. That fact alone should tell you everything. So how does a country in this position keep the lights on? Now let's trace the pound's destruction. Exact dates, because they matter. November 3, 2016. First major devaluation. The pound plunges from 8.88 to roughly 18 per dollar. A 48% collapse overnight. This was the IMF's condition for a $12 billion bailout. 5 years of artificial stability follow, pegged around 15.7. March 2022. Russia invades Ukraine. Finance Minister Mate later reported $22 billion in portfolio investment fleeing Egypt within weeks. The pound drops to 18.5. October 2022. Second devaluation, falls to 24. January 2023. Third devaluation, crashes to 31. Then comes the black market. The official rate froze around 31, but the real rate, the one Egyptians actually paid, peaked above £70 per dollar in late January 2024. A gap of over 100%. March 6, 2024. Fourth devaluation. The central bank moves to a flexible exchange rate. The pound hits roughly 52 per dollar on day 1. Now think about what that means if you're an ordinary Egyptian. Your salary didn't quintuple, but everything you buy did. Net result, 8.88 in 2016 to about 48 today. The Egyptian pound has lost 81% of its value in a decade. For 108 million Egyptians, those aren't exchange rate numbers. They're the price of onions, the cost of bread, the question of whether dinner happens tonight. While the currency was collapsing, Sisi was building. He himself claimed Egypt spent $400 to $500 billion on infrastructure in 7 years. No independent verification exists, but the spending was staggering. The new administrative capital, $58 billion for Phase 1 alone. 51% owned by the Ministry of Defense. Only about 25,000 families live there. Apartments start at roughly $50,000, in a country where GDP per capita is under $3,000. Let that sink in. El Dabar nuclear power plant, $30 billion, 85% financed by a $25 billion Russian loan. Russia will supply the fuel for 60 years. High-speed rail, $23 billion, 2,000 kilometers. Meanwhile, private investment averages just 6.3% of GDP, 1/5 the average for middle-income countries. Roughly 500 of 1,000 private construction companies have shut down or gone bankrupt. The military built a cement factory with 13 million tons of annual capacity into a market that was already oversupplied, and destroyed private competitors in the process. But what if I told you the most dangerous number isn't the debt, the currency, or the construction? It's what Egyptians eat. Egypt is the world's #1 wheat importer, 12 to 14 million metric tons every year. Before the Ukraine war, 85 to 86% came from Russia and Ukraine. 70 million Egyptians depend on subsidized baladi bread. 250 to 270 million loaves baked every single day. In June 2024, the government raised the bread price for the first time in 36 years, quadrupled it from 5 to 20 piastres per loaf. The government had been subsidizing 96% of production costs. No major protests followed, though Egypt's pervasive security apparatus makes independent assessment difficult. Here's the historical echo you need to hear. The 1977 bread riots nearly toppled President Sadat. Many historians draw a direct line from those riots to the 2011 revolution. Food inflation peaked at 73.6% in September 2023. Onions alone hit 423% annual inflation. The word for bread in Arabic, aish, literally means life. Hey, quick question for the comments. If you were an Egyptian pensioner who bought those 12% Canal bonds in 2015, would you still trust the government, or would you be looking for the exit? Let me know below. But the most cynical part of this story isn't the numbers. It's who keeps paying to keep this system alive, and why. So the debt quadrupled, the currency collapsed, and the military kept building empires. You'd think at some point the international community would stop writing checks. You'd be wrong, and the reason why is the real story. Egypt has turned geopolitical leverage into an ATM. Every time it nears the brink, someone bails it out, not because the reforms are working, but because the alternative is too terrifying. The Chatham House verdict. Egypt is too big to be allowed to fail, largely because of the inevitable repercussions for its Israeli, Arab, and European neighbors. Robert Mogilnicki at the Arab Gulf States Institute put it more bluntly: too big to fail, but also too big to bail out. In 2024, Egypt assembled a $57 billion plus rescue package in a single year. $35 billion from the UAE, $8 billion from the IMF, 7.4 billion euros from the European Union, structured as 5 billion in loans, 1.8 billion in investments, and 200 million in grants tied explicitly to migration management. The EU paid because Egypt became the #1 source of irregular migration to Europe in 2022. The US paid because Egypt mediates the Israel-Gaza conflict. Everyone paid up. This is the trap, not for Egypt, but for everyone invested in Egypt not collapsing. But here's the structural problem no bailout can fix, because the bailouts themselves are part of the trap. Here's how it works. Step 1. Egypt borrows heavily. Step 2. It funnels the money into mega projects and military enterprises. Step 3. Those projects don't generate returns. The private sector gets crowded out. Growth disappoints. Step 4. Debt mounts. Currency comes under pressure. Forced devaluation. Step 5. Devaluation spikes food and fuel prices. Social pressure builds. The government resists reform. Step 6. The IMF and Gulf states bail Egypt out. Conditions imposed but never fully implemented. Step 7. The bailout stabilizes things temporarily and the government resumes borrowing and building. Return to Step 1. If you can see this cycle, you already understand more about Egypt's economy than most foreign policy analysts will admit on camera. The 2016 IMF program, $12 billion, was supposed to transform Egypt. The result? External debt nearly doubled from $79 billion to $156 billion by 2022. Poverty rose from 27.8% to 32.5%. The IMF itself later acknowledged that growth was driven by external borrowing, not structural improvement. Privatization was the big promise. Prime Minister Madbouli announced 32 state-owned companies for sale across 18 sectors. Target: $6.5 billion. By July 2025, only 9 had been partially divested. Not a single share of any military company was sold, despite 8 years of discussion. The IMF projected $3 billion from privatization by the end of fiscal year 2024-25. Egypt delivered $600 million, 20% of target. And while privatization was supposedly ongoing, military-owned companies were making new acquisitions in hospitality, energy, and steel. Yazid Sa'i at Carnegie put it best. How, then, to assess a lender that claims to seek structural economic reform and yet settles repeatedly for a mirage? After the March 2024 reforms, carry trade investors poured back in. By late 2025, foreigners held $30 to $38 billion in Egyptian local currency T-bills at roughly 27% yields, the third highest in the developing world. Think of it this way. Imagine lending your neighbor $1,000 at 27% interest. Sounds great, until you realize he's using your money to pay back a different neighbor he already owes. That's the carry trade in Egypt. And this is the exact same pattern that preceded the 2022 crisis. Hot money hit record highs, then $22 billion fled in weeks when Russia invaded Ukraine. Egypt lost roughly $20 billion during COVID, about $15 billion during the 2018 emerging market sell-off. The carry trade isn't economic recovery. It's a leveraged bet on stability that can reverse overnight. The harsh reality is, every obvious fix runs into the same wall. Just privatize the military. The military is the regime's power base. Sisi is a military man. The IMF demands it, then keeps lending anyway. Just earn more from the canal. Record $10.25 billion in 2023 still wasn't enough. Canal revenue is only about 2% of GDP directly, and geopolitics can wipe out 61% in a single year. Just cut subsidies. 70 million people rely on subsidized bread. Last time Egypt touched bread, 1977 riots, which contributed to the 2011 revolution. The word for bread literally means life. Just grow the economy. GDP growth hit 5.3% in early 2025. But with 81% currency loss, nominal growth is wiped out for ordinary Egyptians. This has all happened before. In the 19th century, Khedive Ismail, Egypt's ruler, launched an aggressive campaign of debt-financed modernization. Sound familiar? He couldn't service the debt. So in 1875, he sold Egypt's Suez Canal shares to Britain. 7 years later, Britain occupied Egypt entirely. Then, canal shares. Now, Mediterranean coastline. The mechanism hasn't changed in 150 years. Egypt has had 13 IMF programs, not 24. That figure you'll see repeated everywhere belongs to Pakistan. Egypt doesn't need 24 programs to get trapped. It did it in 13. It's the IMF's second largest debtor, behind only Argentina. And then, in February 2024, Egypt made the deal that revealed exactly how this trap works. February 23, 2024. Egypt sold the development rights to Ras El Hekma, 170 square kilometers of pristine Mediterranean coastline, to Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth fund ADQ for $35 billion. The biggest deal in Egypt's history. $15 billion arrived within a week. Another $20 billion by May. The cash allowed Egypt to float the pound, unify the official and black market rates, and unlock an expanded $8 billion IMF program. Timothy Caldas at the Tahrir Institute didn't mince words. This is clearly a country selling public assets under duress. All this is doing is lighting money on fire for an unsustainable economic model. Now watch where the money went. Reserves rebuilt to a record $56.9 billion. The black market collapsed. Inflation fell from 40% to 12%. Sounds like a success story, right? But Egypt owed $32.8 billion in debt servicing in 2024. Nearly the entire Ras El Hekma windfall. The $35 billion didn't rebuild the economy, it serviced old debts. The money arrived, passed through, and vanished into obligations accumulated over a decade of borrowing. And the human cost. Roughly 10,000 residents, predominantly Bedouin communities that have lived on this coastline for generations, now face eviction so the UAE can build luxury resorts most Egyptians will never afford. Then it happened again. November 6, 2025. Egypt signed a second deal, selling development rights for the Semla and Alam El Roum areas to Qatar's Qatari Daya for $29.7 billion. More Mediterranean coastline. Same pattern. Initial payment of $3.5 billion received by December 30th. The historical echo is exact. In 1875, Khedive Ismail sold Egypt's canal shares to Britain to avoid bankruptcy. In 2024, Sisi sold the Mediterranean to the UAE for the same reason. Egypt didn't fix its economy. It sold a piece of the Mediterranean to buy another year. So what happens when you run out of coastline to sell? Early 2026. The IMF just completed its combined 5th and 6th reviews, unlocking roughly $2.3 billion. They called progress encouraging, but warned of over-reliance on short-term borrowing. GDP growth is improving, 5.3% in the first quarter. Inflation is down to about 12% from 40%. Reserves sit at a record $52.6 billion. The Suez Canal is recovering. Q4 2025 revenue up 24.5% year-over-year after the October 2025 Gaza ceasefire. The Canal Authority projects $8 billion by fiscal year 2026-27 and $10 billion by 2027-28. Sounds like the story is turning around. But the structural trap remains. The military is expanding its empire. Privatization exists on paper. $30 to $38 billion in hot money is ready to flee at the first shock. And Egypt faces roughly $44 billion in debt servicing between 2025 and 2026. Now, why should you care if you've never been to Egypt? European energy prices spiked 15% during the 2024 canal disruption. Every container rerouted around Africa adds $1 million and 10 days to the voyage. You've already paid for Egypt's instability, at the gas pump, at the grocery store, in the price of everything that crosses an ocean. You just didn't know it. Bull case. And I'm being generous calling it that. The canal recovers, Gulf investment continues, gradual reform takes hold. Egypt grows out, slowly, over a decade. Base case, and the most likely one, muddle through continues. Each crisis gets a bailout. More coastline gets sold. Military reform